Coming up on Theater Talk.
I think it's a great art form, being a producer. Most people don't really understand it. And most people look at, Nathan Lane and the producers and big fat cigars. And that's what Hollywood
and corrupt. That's
what Hollywood has done, right, for 100 years.
Right. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation and Ellen Seagrove. From New York City, this is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins.
And I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post. Now, Susan, there's a new book out about being a Broadway producer, which may be the hardest job in the theater. The book is called I Want to Be a Producer, How to Make a Killing on Broadway, or, and this is the important part, Get Killed on Broadway. The author is John Breglio, a very famous theatrical lawyer here in New York, and also a producer in his own right. He did revivals of A Chorus Line on Broadway and Dreamgirls that toured extensively. John, welcome to Theater Talk.
Nice to be here.
All right, I got to ask you the subtitle, or Get Killed.
Yeah.
When you're a producer, I mean, the emotional, intellectual toll on you must be enormous.
Well, it's one of the reasons I wrote the book is that so few people really understand what a producer is.
Yeah.
They have no idea. You go to a cocktail party and people say, "Oh, what do you do?" And you say, "Well, I produce or I represent producers," and then they scratch their head and they say, "Well, what do they do?" I have no idea. Some people think it's what a director does.
Right.
Or what does the director do what the producer does? They don't get it, and it's so multifaceted, as we all know. Today, you walk into the theater and you see 45 names
above the title.
Right. But we know that maybe one or two people at the very beginning are the producers. And it really occurred to me, now that I'm far along in my career, that it might be really helpful to write something and for me to give back everything I've learned from so many productions when I acted sort of as a shadow producer for so many and others, to sort of put in one book all the stuff, the great stuff, all the crap, all the disappointments, everything that a producer goes through and doesn't even know what he or she's going to go through when they start. But then I said, well, that's kind of a bore. I mean, that sounds a little too dry. So then I pulled from my memory bank.
From your own life, from your association with people like Michael Bennett and Lloyd Webber and the Schuberts and
Nederlander, everybody that I either represented or worked with, and all the great producers, directors, choreographers, actors.
If you can tell us, though, for people who don't know what a producer does, aside from get killed, what does a producer of a Broadway show do? Well,
without, belaboring it, to really encapsulate it, it's really a combination. If you're building a skyscraper, what the architect does, the contractor does, and the designer does, you in effect do all those things, but you don't actually use your own hands. You supervise it all.
Right.
You have to be on top of it all. But I think the thing that's most misunderstood at the very beginning of the process, when producers acquire material, okay, they acquire material in a book or maybe a movie, something like that, and that's their idea. That is the formative stages. And that is the very, very beginning. And and some, I think, naive or untutored producers think that's sort of the end. They buy the movie rights to, stage rights to a big movie, and they think, well, now I've got those rights. It's got to be a hit because it was a big movie. But it only begins, and it only begins in the sense that you now got to figure out, why is it a play?
Right.
Why is it a musical?
Why can this be adapted to the theater?
Exactly. And a producer has to be careful, because now you start looking for the book writer, the composer, the lyricist, and those people out there often, especially if they're not tutored themselves, are going to think, oh, this was going to be an easy one because that's a great movie, and I'll just take the play, the movie script, and I'll make it a play. We'll put some songs in it, and that's we know that's a prescription for disaster. We've seen so many of those, right?
Totally.
But the producer has to be out there constantly watching that process. And one of the things I talk about a lot is collaboration. And in my experience, unless those people, book writer, composer, lyricist, ultimately director, choreographer, scenic, are collaborating and all on that same road and all in that same idea, a concept of what they're headed for, you could never have a successful musical. Those are to me, the indicia of a great musical. The collaboration took hold, and in many ways you can't pull it apart because it's such an organic piece.
And it's the producer's job to make sure that they are on that same road, that this one's not going off here or going down
Because that's
this.
what happens.
Yeah.
You know, one of them is too busy and has so many shows going on. Sometimes the director is too busy, or the designers come in too late, and designers don't really have any idea of what the writers really want to achieve, and there isn't enough of a dialogue. It can go wrong in so many ways. To me, that is the most important thing a producer does, to find the balance between being a pain in the and interfering all the time and micromanaging and saying, you know, I want the Klieg lights to go there instead of up there. But being able to stay back
and let them do the creative work.
Stay back, but stay back and see where it goes wrong, but then intervene when you really have to.
Do you also have to be a psychologist in a sense? You have to understand the mental and emotional state of your collaborators and know exactly when to bore down, when to coddle, when to pull back.
And who you can do that with.
Right.
Some writers you can't bore down, no matter how much you try. They're just not bore-downable. They just aren't. They're like this. And you got to be careful with writers like that.
And then what do you do?
Well, you have to decide whether you're going to hire them.
No, but
once you hire them,
Yeah.
see, if you knew it beforehand,
no, then
you know
you're a
what you're-
fool.
yeah.
But
then you take what you get, because
Right.
they may be so great and so wonderful and so accomplished that
Right.
you say, you know what, for this artist, I took him for what he is or her, and I've got to accept that. I mean, there's some great artists, like playwrights. You know, musicals are different. Playwrights, nobody ever told Arthur Miller or Tennessee Williams or Eugene O'Neill as went along, maybe their agent talked to them a little bit, you're going the wrong way. You've got to bore down on them. Musicals are different. So when you have someone who's sort of stuck in the mud, if you know that's the kind of writer they have before, you get what you pay for. If you don't, and you find it out during the process, you've got to make a decision early on, whether you can continue to work with that person, and whether the other writers can continue to work with them. And oftentimes it's the writers who can't work with them because there's no collaboration.
I've seen so many shows in my day, and many times, particularly in the not-for-profit theater, I'll see shows where I say, why didn't the producer step in?
Where was somebody here
Where
saying,
were
no,
they?
this
Yeah.
doesn't
It's
work?
not just the not-for-profit theater.
Yeah.
How many times, I've said this so many times when I've talked
Yeah.
about this book, people ask me the question, how many times you've been in a Broadway theater, and you turn to whoever you're with and you say, how did this get on the stage?
That's right.
Who was working on it? And then you forget about it and you go home. More than not, it's the producers.
And there's times when I look and go, oh, it's somebody who owns a tire company in Tennessee is the lead producer. And then I get that because they didn't know any better. But sometimes when there's somebody up there, you think, are they collecting their management fees, or what are they doing?
Well, well, the management fees,
fine.
it's interesting how managers sometimes are guilty of churning them out.
Yeah.
I mean, they get their fees. Nobody likes the show. I'll go on to my next one. But I think the curious thing is that what I found, and it really helped me as a producer, having represented so many artists, is that no matter how wonderful they are, even the great director choreographers, they're ultimately an artist for their own craft. So that lyricist really is honing in on her words, and that book writer is honing on his words, and that director's honing on. And even though directors are supposed to have that big vision, sometimes they're so stuck in it. And if you see that happening, more often than not, again, there's only one person who can sit them all back and say, okay, guys, I have a feeling you're still not bringing it together as a whole. And that's the producer. And you have to know that personality. You have to have the instinct to know when you can be tough on them and when you can't be tough on them. I think it's a great art form, being a producer, but most people don't really understand it. And most people look at, Nathan Lane and the producers and Big Fat Cigars. And that's what Hollywood
And corrupt.
That's what Hollywood has done, right, for 100 years.
right.
So why would they know anything better?
Scott Rudin, a very accomplished producer in our business, he said to me once, I'll never forget this, he said, you know what, the only thing a producer really has is taste. The taste to hire the people, the taste to go for the material, the taste to make it look good at the end. And he said that is the key thing a producer must have, is taste. Do you agree with that?
I agree that it's an important element, but I would venture to say it's a little too simplistic to look at it just that way. There's so much more in the beginning that you need to do when you're developing a piece. Yes, taste is part of it. But as we've been talking at one point, taste could be a problem.
Yeah, yes, it can be if you've
you
got bad
want
taste.
Or if your taste is too good, even. I don't know what that means, but there is a commerciality to pieces too. But yes, taste is terribly important. You can't teach taste. I mean, that's like teaching someone, I suppose, how to be nice. You're either nice or you're not.
Right. How to have empathy. But you bear down a lot in this book on real details on things that a successful producer has to be mindful of. The capitalization.
Yes.
Dealing with really terrible stars. Then there you have people who are, theater overlords who are brutalizing you. All kinds of things you would not have to be dealing with, one would think, as a producer, and you are saying, no, you have to be able to cope on all these fronts.
Well, I go into a fair amount of detail, especially in the financial stuff, because what I found with a lot of clients when I was, as I said, sort of shadow producing, is that they had no concept whatsoever of how money was paid, how money was raised, how money was spent, and they hire a general manager, and the general manager comes up with a budget, and thank you very much, that's the end of it, and then they just assume the lawyer and the manager are going to do everything themselves. But that is really, I think, totally irresponsible, because a manager will create a budget based on what they see in a script, and then a manager will do a projection of how long it takes to get money back. But unless the producer looks at that and really has some understanding of how those numbers can be massaged to make the piece a little bit more attractive for investors or not, he or she is going to find themselves totally lost when they go out for money. Because today, a lot of these investors, those 45 people in there, are a lot more savvy than they were 30 years ago.
Well, they used to be called angels. They used to show up, they would write David Merrick a check, and he would say, see you on opening night.
Exactly.
Now they write a check for $250,000, $500,000, and they want to be in there when you decide what color the poster's going to be.
So they go the other extreme.
Right.
Now they want the color of the poster to fit what they say. A lot of those investors still don't know exactly what's going on, but the first thing most people ask now are projections. I mean, can I get my money back in some, before I turn 150? And that's, you look at these projections, and they're staggering what some of them are.
Can you give us an example today of this kind of schedule for your typical Broadway musical, which is so expensive?
Well, it's a little far back, but it's a very good example. It still pertains to today. A show called Victor Victoria.
Yeah, Julie Andrews, Blake Edwards.
And Blake Edwards. And everybody thought this is a sure winner because Julie Andrews, has been on Broadway since My Fair Lady. And biggest star in Hollywood and the world, and the greatest lady in the you can imagine in the theater anywhere. And Blake came to me and Julie because they had never done a Broadway. He had never done a Broadway show. Blake never directed, never produced, but he wanted to self-produce. He wanted to direct, and Julie. And there was another group that was helping them finance it, but they had never produced a Broadway show either. And we got going. Blake did his script, and it was budgeted, and the budget came back, and they sent it to me, and the people who were raising the money, and Blake thought it was perfectly fine, and I brought them in my office. I said, well, and this happens a lot. I said, look at your projections. Julie Andrews will no doubt sell out, okay? But you can't really do everything on a complete sellout, and we didn't have premium pricing then. And even today, you got to be a fool if you expect it.
Right, exactly. If you budget thinking every ticket's going to be $800, that could lead to rack and ruin.
Probably you can, but
right.
But he'll only be there for 3 months.
Exactly.
And then you sit there, and then I knew she was going to be there for 9 months. Well, I figured out. I showed them at 9 months, they were only 60% recouped. And they said, well, that doesn't make any difference. We'll make a lot more money near the end, and we'll sell. And I said, what do you mean it doesn't make any difference? He said, well, people don't really look at that. I said, you can't go out and raise money when people think the show's going to run 9 months with Julie Andrews. They said, well, we can always replace her. No. Hugh Jackman, Julie Andrews.
Nathan Lane.
I don't know. Hello, Dolly, Bette Midler, can you? I don't know. Who knows? But you can't, these kinds of stars you can't replace. You have to assume when they're gone, it's over. So we redid everything. We redid the sets. We redid everything had to be redone.
You repriced.
So that, yes. And I insisted that at 75% capacity, they could recoup in 7 or 8 months. So that if it was 100% capacity, they'd make a little money.
Right.
And it was all redone. That is exactly what is or is not done with some of these shows. And I love our British friends. They're wonderful. But they have been guilty when they come here of a lot of their big musicals of not putting that sharp pencil the way they should.
Well, I think an example of that, because I've been hearing, and I love the show, and it should have been a bigger hit than it was Matilda. Matilda was a classic case of a show that had everything going for it. Great show, great reviews, word of mouth, audience there for it. And yet a lot of people I know had money and are thinking, well, there should have been more here. Yeah. There should have been more.
Well, you start off with a cast of children. How many are in there? Yeah. 15 or whatever. So you've got tutors, you've got understudies, you've got to come up with a school for children. I mean, the first people who ever found that out were Billy Elliot, another show that never returned.
Great show, too.
That's why I say I love our British friends, but it's a real problem. And they come here, and they're not really as au courant as they should be, maybe, with American economics.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happens. You look back. I mean, I have involvement with Matilda, and I can assure you, people were not too happy with what happened. Although I think it's one of the greatest musicals I've ever seen.
Let me ask you, John, of all of the great producers that you advised in the past, a particular favorite of yours, somebody that you really, really admired?
The two ladies that I admired the most in their heyday were Liz McCann and Nell Nugent. And in their heyday, they were not musical play producers.
They did The Elephant Man, Dracula, Mornings at 7.
Nicholas Nickleby.
Yeah.
I mean, they really were the ideal. And the reason they were such a great pair is that Liz, not only is she a wonderful woman and a great wit and knowledgeable about the theater and can read a script and knows how to talk to Peter Shaffer or to
Edward Albee.
Edward Albee. She knows how to sit down, and that's a great important thing, besides having taste, to sit down with your playwright and your writer so that they respect you. I mean, for whatever reason, there are a lot of writers and whatever who say, "Oh, the producer."
He's the money person.
Yeah,
the
and
money
then
person.
They give you notes, and it goes into the smallest room in the house, circular. But Liz had that wonderful talent and great taste. Nell, also a great woman of the theater, but was a real pencil woman. She could give you a budget. She could save you, on this table, she'd find out how to get it for 20% less, even if you got it for, wholesale. She knew how to do that. So they brought to the table, I think, an incredible talent.
And there were women, too, in a business that's been dominated by men.
Dominated by the Schuberts and by
Niederlander.
Every Niederlander. But they all, especially Jimmy. I mean, they worked for Jimmy, Jimmy Niederlander, and he adored them. And I started with them when I formed their company and saw them grow up from, just starting as general managers and working for Jimmy up to really, they were on the cover of, most magazines, and they were
So you were a real kid when you started with them.
Oh, yeah, no, I was.
What about someone else you worked for that I'm fascinated by, Robert Stigwood?
Yeah, I mean, Robert is, when you ask me, a great producer, he's a great entrepreneur. We don't have entertainment moguls, I'll put it that way.
Right.
The 70s and 80s in the film business, in the theater business, well, not so much the theater business. Well, Merrick was a mogul.
Yeah.
And in the record business, Clive Davis is still around.
Yeah.
They were moguls. They had vision about everything. Robert Stigwood was a producer a manager, a record producer, had his own record label, had his own music publishing company.
And produced Saturday Night Fever and Grease.
Movie producer, TV producer,
Yeah.
and theater producer. You couldn't turn around in his world without him getting a piece. I mean, when the Bee Gees did those two big musicals, not to mention their whole career, he was getting it from every angle. Record manager, publisher,
and then living on the yacht, so he didn't have to pay taxes anymore.
Biggest shot, one of the biggest yachts in the world. I mean, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because those were the days of the moguls. There was something about their ability to produce on a scale that no one else really thought about or did, and to get great artists to work for them. Right. I mean, Peter Frampton and the Bee Gees, and even the Beatles earlier on, Robert Stigwood worked with them all. They all wanted to be with him. And they all sat at his feet. Angel Lloyd Webber, and
Tim Rice started with,
and all Michael Eisner,
yep.
Jeffrey Katzenberg. They all idolized Robert Stigwood.
Were these moguls like Stigwood? I mean, they were clearly seductive, but were they also scary? Is it important to be feared as a producer at times?
Well, take Robert, for example. Not so much. He was the most generous, the most cunning, and also seductive producer you could imagine. He'd get anybody to do anything for him. But if you either crossed him or didn't do what he wanted to do, talking about a producer needs to get, I'm sure people watch out. A movie you've heard of, Saturday Night Fever, mm-hmm. which I did with him. We made with Paramount. He hired John Avildsen. John Avildsen was on the top of the world. He's one of the hottest directors in Hollywood. And they were in photography. They were literally starting to shoot, but it was Robert's own film. It wasn't a studio film. He sold it.
He owned it, yeah. He owned most of that movie.
Later distributed by Paramount. And he had this huge blow up in Central Park West, you know, with San Remo. He owned the great tower up there. And they had this huge fight. And he called me up, ran over there, and he said, I fired Avildsen. I don't want his ending. His ending is not the way the movie should end. And that day he hired John Badham to direct the film. John came in that night. They talked about it. Now, that takes guts.
And it had the new ending.
And yeah, it had the ending Robert wanted, which is the two of them basically looking towards the future, whatever.
Out the window.
Avildsen wanted a daughter.
And he didn't care how much it was going to cost him to fire that director, who probably had a very good contract on that?
No idea. Well, you know, guess how much Saturday Night Fever cost Robert Stigwood to produce?
$12 million?
$3 million.
Oh my God! How much did it gross?
Still grossing. Still grossing.
Yeah.
$3 million. But you want to know something? Independent film in 1978 of $3 million, where it's all your own money. There's nobody on the planet who was doing that because it was a risky venture. Right. Who knew what this thing was?
But these guys are also about control. They controlled every aspect of what they did.
When you say was he scary, he was scary in the sense that it was his baby. He didn't have to talk to
studio head, executives,
anybody up there. And then he sold it to Paramount. And I'll tell you another story about this, giving you what great entrepreneur moguls did. It's different from like great producers because these are moguls. Film is finished, right? He keeps the rest of the world except U.S. and we make a deal with Paramount for domestic rights, Barry Diller. And we have the deal done, and it's what's called a negative pickup, which means that you deliver the negative, Robert delivers the negative, mm-hmm. they pick it up and they pay him $3 million. So now he's completely whole for having sold it to Paramount, but then he has a piece of the gross. We made a gross deal for Robert. 40% of distributors' gross. Never has a deal like that been made. It's staggeringly profitable. 40% of the gross.
Right off the top. Wow, amazing.
Of distributors' gross after the theater takes theater exhibitors. So this is a phenomenal deal. He delivers the movie to them. And we screen it at the old Paramount screening room, which is now, Columbus Circle. And they all get up. The next day, they call Robert, and Barry says, we can't distribute it unless you make it GP. It's R. This is too tough. There's too much sex.
They have sex in the back seat, right.
They didn't want an R backseat and a lot of language. Yeah, 1970, this is not 2016. So I call Robert, and he knows about it. We talk about it. That instant, he calls me and says, tell them to send the negative back. They've breached the agreement. It's an R film. I have the right to make it an R film. It's over. I said, well, hung up on me. That's it. That's what Robert would do. So I called him and said, it's over. If you want it to be GP, he will not recut the picture. It's R. He's going elsewhere. You can keep your $3 million. Again, it sounds like no money. But a huge amount of money for someone who's just laid it out and doesn't know what's going to happen. Within 24 hours, they
Amazing. Well, the book is I Want to Be a Producer, How to Make a Killing, as Robert Stigwood did apparently, or get killed on Broadway if it doesn't go well. Fascinating book. Tells you these great stories, but also just the logistics, the technique that you have to have at your fingertips to produce a Broadway show.
And the resiliency, John Breglio.
You've got to have a tough skin, especially if you appear in my column.
And you got to have a gimmick too, I guess. I don't know.
Exactly. All right, John Breglio, thanks for being our guest on Theater Talk. The book is I Want to Be a Producer, How to Make a Killing on Broadway or Get Killed. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Good to see you.
Our thanks to the Friends of Theater Talk for their significant contribution to this production. Theater Talk is made possible in part by the Frederick Lowe Foundation, the Corey and Bob Donnelly Charitable Fund, the Noel Coward Foundation, Carrie J. Fries, the Dorothy Strelson Foundation, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you,